Welcome, everybody. I'm Xavier de Souza Briggs, or Zav for short. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about equity and shelter and the future of these important things. We're pleased to be joining you as part of Geography 2050. And it's my pleasure to begin by introducing our two wonderful panelists, Crystal Cornegay and Carlos Martin. Crystal is, I know you have access to their full bio, so I will give the short versions. Crystal, Carlos, bear with me. Crystal is Executive Director of Mass Housing, which lends over $1 billion annually to expand affordable rental and homeownership opportunities for low and moderate income borrowers in Massachusetts. And she also serves on a number of boards, so she's deeply connected to the conversation or the interactions between housing and transportation and transit specifically. And there's a lot to share along these lines. Carlos is the David Rubenstein Fellow and my colleague at the Brookings Institution in the Metropolitan Policy Program, and has been based previously at the Urban Institute and been a professor, trained originally as an engineer and architect and historian of technology. I should say Crystal trained as a planner, among other hats she wears. So a warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us in conversation. You know, we want to make sure that we can look ahead and think about the long run today, and take the conversation, of course, to what needs doing and what needs asking. What do we need to figure out in the near term? And Crystal, I wonder if I could start with you. I know you've given a lot of thought to the future of housing affordability, of equity and economic opportunity in the broad sense, and of course, the important role of housing finance as a key piece of that puzzle. And I want to invite you, in the spirit of what draws us together in this conference, to look way ahead for us and ask, what are some long-run futures that you can imagine when it comes to equity and shelter and the way our capital markets or our finance system either does or doesn't help us create the future that we ought to have?
Thank you. And thank you both for having me here with you guys. I'm not a scholar like you guys. And so a lot of my impressions about this stuff is based on what I know on the ground and what I see, and the way that I want to envision our future and where we go. As you both know, community development is actually what is the term I learned, like a future back thing, right? And so it's all like thinking about what you do today, because community development work, affordable housing, this is generational work, right? And so everything you do today is going to impact future generations. I think that we're going to have to create a housing finance system that takes into account different cultures, which it does not now, right? Mm-hmm. And as we become much more diverse populace in the United States, and thinking about where the different ways that people earn money and how they account for that, right? It's like we're going to have this gig economy that's emerging. And if we don't want to have a group of people who have and a big group of people who have not, then we've got to think about what does a middle class look like, so to speak, and how do people access those markets in ways that we haven't in the future. We are also going to get to a place, I think, in 100 years where shelter is a basic right. And because we're just going to have to. And that's also going to impact how the finance system evolves and who are the basic winners and losers around those systems. So that's some of what I think about.
Crystal, can I push you on this? I want to understand some of the nuances of what you said before we get Carlos in here. On one hand, you know, from your lips, may it be the case that we have housing or shelter as a basic human right. And preparing for today's conversation, we were linking a bit to the UN conversation, and we know that there are countries that have declared housing a so-called social and economic right, something that society has an obligation to help provide. We don't have one in this country, at least not a formally codified one. As you think about, say, 20 years out, 25 years out, as you put it, a generational leap forward, help me understand the scenarios a little bit more. So I'm going to suggest, I may get this wrong, one is sort of status quo forward. We have a monocultural finance system. It makes a set of assumptions about how everybody earns money, a salaried income as opposed to something more gig-like or irregular. And in being monocultural, and I want to ask you to, given the last year and a half we've had too, and the mass protests over racial justice, it occurs to me, monocultural is not the same as inherently racist, but we have the fact that the finance system was not created to serve everyone. That's just a documented historical fact. So when you think about the futures, plural, there's this kind of status quo one. And is the alternative one that's much more flexible and responsive to different cultures within our country and also to different ways that people earn their livelihoods? Could you say more about these different features?
I just think that in 20 years, let's think about our own kids, right? It's I just think in 20 years, you're going to have to underwrite who's buying houses differently, right? The number of people who are going to have enough money to buy a house in the United States is going to dramatically shrink. And therefore, that industry is going to have to think differently about how they open opportunity for people and what risk they're willing to take. And that's just going to shift over time. And the system is, we all know, racism is a very important part of American culture, right? And when I say important, I just mean it's foundational, right? And like land rights are foundational. And so how we shift around those things are really going to be about economics. It's not, I don't know that it's going to be about, equity and justice. I just think the economics are going to force people to start to think differently about equity and justice and how you let people participate in this economy.
Well, we're going to circle back to this and really dig deep into this over the next hour or so. That's sobering, what you just said, especially the way you kind of juxtaposed the economics with the equity and justice. I'm going to take one piece of what you said and maybe use it as a bridge to get Carlos in here. I think you were also naming technological change, if not at length yet, and I will come back. Things like the rise of fintech, different ways of calculating credit scores, of thinking about creditworthiness, all these things that are very important for the way our finance system is evolving. Carlos, welcome. And I want to put this same question to you. What futures can you imagine? I know you've given a lot of thought to the ways in which, for example, technological change, economic change, demographic change, and climatic change, climate risk, climate change, interact, and what kinds of challenges and possibilities they create. So same question to you. What futures kind of 20, 25 years out can you imagine?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And Crystal, you sound like a scholar to me. And you sound like a visionary. And I think in addition to thinking about housing as a right, we have to start thinking about clean air as a right, clean water as a right, and how about futures as a right, having futures for our posterity as a right. So whenever we talk about visions, I always get a little scared because we've all gone through moments where we've set up visions in our head and we are disappointed. But if you feel like there are opportunities that exist, given the historical changes that we've seen, at least the uprisings, the movement that we've seen in the last couple of years, to rethink some of our visions. And so I'm also, and Zav, I'm going to harken back to our HUD days, right? Because whenever we talk about visions about housing, we always think safe, decent, affordable housing, right? The old HUD line. And so part of my vision is not so much technological, but it's really still social. And it's how the technology, how the production, the supply chain can help support that social vision. I mean, that's ultimately technology. I'm going to quote colleagues of mine in the history of technology to say, technology is neither positive, nor is it negative, nor is it neutral, right? It's all in how it is structured to benefit both society and planet, people and planet. So I would say the best vision I could have of housing is where all levels of government, local, state, national, and potentially even global, are producing the best possible housing and the community, best possible communities for each individual resident in the U.S. So, I mean, there are some low bars we can strive towards, right? And that's a broad vision, but I want to make sure that households in the communities are at the center of that vision. Unfortunately, our local, state, and national governments are structured with very different motivations, with very different funding resources, and people slip through the cracks. So the lowest bar is, let's have no one slip through the cracks anymore, right? So housing as a right is a fundamental way of envisioning that, which means we have to produce enough housing and produce it all in the right places for our planet. Another low bar, just improving social connections in communities. And this is both within neighborhoods, making sure that what exists is maintained, that there are social networks. We've never viewed social and neighborhood networks as a priority in our housing and our community development. From a policy standpoint, we as people often, I mean, that's where we live. We know our neighbors, we talk to our neighbors. So we have to think about how housing in our communities can improve that social connection, particularly across income and racial lines. So thinking about mixed income, integrated communities, I think these are unfortunately low bars that we've been talking about, I think, for 50 years in this country, and we still haven't achieved. And the third low bar I would want to add to that is minimizing environmental impact. And knowing that we are humans, we are affecting this planet, we are affecting our local ecosystems as well as the overall climate. So we have to realize that we are having an impact. There's no such thing as negative impact or zero impact, but we can try to minimize that and ensure that people are building in the right places. So there are a lot of challenges getting there, right? So that was my version of a vision. If you wanted me to talk about challenges, there are a whole lot, right? Because we haven't reached that basic fundamental low bar vision. So one is low capacity and a lot of
Can I interject for 1 second?
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but let's come back to challenges in just a moment. But if you bear with me,
but I love talking about challenges.
You guys, well, what we want to do in this first part of the conversation is cast some scenarios. So not just articulate an aspirational vision, the future we would want, but alternative futures, including some futures we may not want, but crystallize them a little bit, paint them out so we can draw the contrast. So you articulated an aspirational vision and some of the things that stand between now and then. What's an alternative to the positive future you want, and I think I want, and Crystal wants? What's an alternative? Is it a future of smart homes, climate safe for the well-off, and very different housing for everyone else? Or what's that alternative future, one or more, that we may not want at all and that are not in keeping, many would argue, with our highest values? What exactly does it look like? I just want for our conference participants to have them hear it from you.
Right. You've prosed a lot of the scenarios that climate fiction has prosed, right? A lot of dystopias as well as utopias. And I think ultimately we don't want any one person's version of utopia, and we certainly don't want anybody's vision of dystopia. So I think the fundamental challenges about equity are going to be carried over. Housing policy is climate policy now. Now we're recognizing it. It always was. But now we're recognizing that how we deal with our housing affects our not only climate, environmental climate, but also our economic, our sociological climate, our mental health. There's so many other ways. So I would say we're talking about specific visions. There are a couple of scenarios that I've toyed with and have actually talked to other scholars and reporters about things like thinking about resilient entitlement. When we're talking about entitlement communities in this country, we're thinking about economic deprivation. We're not looking at environmental deprivation, places of environmental injustice that deserve reckoning. So thinking about really focusing on those communities that have historically been underinvested, not just in terms of their housing, not just in terms of their economic development opportunities, but also from their environments, from like layers of oppression. So thinking about really focusing on those specific communities, that's one way to reach this vision of making sure nobody slips through the cracks. Another is making sure that local communities have that capacity. I mean, I wanted to get into the challenges because I think part of the challenge is a lot of local communities just don't have the resources, they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the leadership, they don't have the intellectual capital that other places do. And this includes rural communities in the country and tribal communities. And so making sure that we provide that kind of intensive TA and capacity building can put them on an equal playing field. I'm gonna play with one specific policy scenario before. I know I'm talking way too much, but that I've toyed with a good colleague, Jonathan Parfrey from Climate Resolve, who we've talked about mutual resilience agreements. So after disasters and during disasters, I should say, there are a lot of communities will have mutual aid agreements, mutual relief agreements, right, with their neighboring city or county, saying, okay, if we have this issue, you're going to help us have evacuation shelters. You're going to let us use your emergency management offices because ours are down, that sort of thing. Well, why don't we think about this in the longer term? Why don't we think about how our neighboring community may be suffering in the longer term and maybe losing land, maybe losing population, and how we may be less exposed so we can build more housing. We could build more economic development opportunities, more jobs so that they can come to us. We're not thinking in terms of that level. We're not thinking of our neighbors in that way. And I think that's part of my vision, slightly utopic, is that we actually care about our neighbors.
A vision of mutuality and then working out the mechanisms to sort of enact that. We want to explore that some more. Crystal, talk to us about, I'm going to take us now into, how we get from here to there. So we'll avoid the most negative futures or the least desirable aspects of these futures we can imagine and realize more of the positives. What are some of the sort of near-term challenges? You began to name them on the front end of the conversation. What are some of the near-term challenges and for want of a better word, the solves that you think we need to begin to make progress toward a positive future?
Well, one of them is just recognizing because our systems, no matter what they are so big, we kind of play to kind of this narrow definition of who's operating in those systems, and we drive people to look like that, work like that, be like that, and creating some kind of opportunity for more flexibility and just more diversity. And I don't just mean, more diversity around how people participate in that system. One of the things I was thinking about, Carlos, when you were talking, part of why we care about who lives in communities and what resources they have is because of the way communities are financed, which is through real estate taxes, right? And so you have better schools in certain places because, people who live there pay more taxes. And so we have to start thinking differently about that, right? And how we invest in places so that we can create some more of this kind of mixed income, kind of integrated. Because the message we have now for people of lower means is always about, if you want a better opportunity, you have to move someplace, right? Well, you can't move all the poor people. And so you're just so you got to figure out how you're going to invest where people are and what that means. And stop talking about things in a way in which is a zero-sum game, where because I'm giving Zav more means that Carlos is getting less. No, it's like, it's America. And we actually do have enough to go around. And so we got to get rid of that mythology as we start about that, as we start down this path around how we want to have people participate in the economy and why it's important to not create an economy in which, only 2/3 of the populace really participated. Like, because that gap gets to get bigger, and then it's just creating all kinds of different problems that Carlos is talking about. One of the things that I'm worried about when I think about a dystopia is that we end up in this environment in which, I'm slightly exaggerating, but like there's only 20,000 people who own anything in this country, right? Because we're creating all these things. And even with the fintech, right? Like, we're now discovering, like, technology is great, except that, as you said, like, it's a reflection of who programs it. And so, like, what are we thinking about that? And then we're saying, like, well, you're not eligible because the technology said you're not. And I'm just like, okay, well, that's like telling me, that white guy said I'm not eligible. It's like, what's the difference? And so just thinking about, we got to be able to take a little bit of step back, and we got to get out of this place in this like scarcity mode in which, like, we don't have enough. Part of being the greatest country in the world is about having enough. Mm-hmm. And so, let's lean into our greatness of prosperity and enoughness, as opposed to our fear and our scarcity.
Carlos, you want to name more challenges here? It just feels to me like this is a right place to build on each other's notions of what the key challenges are, from, as Crystal says, mindsets of scarcity versus abundance, and missing mechanisms. You began to do this. And I sort of cut you off to articulate the future a little bit more. Say more about challenges, where you were going, and then I think we want to look at some of the entry points, some of the early steps we can take. But tell us more about challenges.
Sure. And just quickly to add to what Crystal was saying, this idea of options, that's what the wealthy and privileged in this country have always had, right? Multiple options in terms of their housing and where they want to be, and where disadvantaged communities, low income, low moderate income communities, communities of color don't have those options. So that's part of the vision, is making sure we have those options. So what are the challenges? So I talked a little about local government capacity and I would even say local neighborhood capacity. In some cases, unfortunately, now we have hostile local governments that don't want to improve capacity of their governmental services, of their ability to arbitrate between local communities. We have unresponsive professionals in the industry. There's been a reckoning in the last couple of years by the appraisers, by real estate agents, et cetera. And I'd like to see more action on that front, not just lip service to what's happened in the past, but actual changes in appraisal practices, constant monitoring, evaluation of appraisal outcomes, of real estate transactions, of lender outcomes, of the kinds that Crystal was mentioning. So these are challenges. There's still an industry that's built around certain ways of thinking and certain ways of producing. I also feel like we have insufficient and often ineffective state and national regulations. I think we have provided, in the housing world, so many carrots and trying to get people to get somewhere, and we need more sticks. We've gotten to the point where we need, at a broader scale of geography at the state and national level, to make communities that are these enclaves that have options and have chosen their options to no longer be enclaves, that they have to realize that they are part of the public commons. And of a democratic society that we aspire to be. Mm-hmm. I'd say that a third big challenge, money. For the exact same reasons Crystal was mentioning. We have a regressive tax system. We have an inability to actually commit resources to all of the changes that we want to see to ensure that democracy persists, and that people have options of all backgrounds. And so that requires money to build more housing. That requires money to retrofit some housing and ensure that it's not in harm's way. It requires money to relocate some communities, and especially the communities that don't have the resources. To your point, Zav, wealthy people have these enclaves and they're going to have choices, and it's going to play out very differently. I don't think there's going to be wealthy climate preserves across the country. I think there are going to be some places like that. There are going to be a lot of wealthy people who say, oh, well, I'll give that property away. They have that option to walk away. And there are going to be some people who try to do the right thing, or at least pretend to do the right thing, and try to think about their communities. And we've seen this play out very recently in the most recent mitigation funding that came from the federal government, where the biggest project, the project that got the biggest amount of money, was indeed looking at 1,000 low-income households of color, but it was also protecting Facebook headquarters. So we have to think about who actually are the beneficiaries and who's going to sort of what alternatives we have to make sure that all people have options and not just the wealthy.
I want to ask both of you, and Crystal, I'll give you plenty of room to directly respond to Carlos if you would like, but I do want to probe on risk for a second. You've both talked about money, entitlement. We talked a little bit about technologies. And Carlos, I'm just going to start with you because of what you just said. How about the treatment of risk and the coverage of risk? I'm thinking of everything from public sector tools and things we know now, imperfect as they are, like the National Flood Insurance Program, to the treatment of risk on property and more by private insurers and reinsurers. Recently, there was a story on why the property insurance industry is not at the forefront, not in the vanguard of the climate movement. And the journalist sort of said, you'd think they would be, since they own risk. It turns out major property insurers in this country are still writing policies on coal mines and offshore oil drilling. It's arguably a very near-term focus. The reinsurers, on the other hand, who own a lot of the catastrophic risk, are moving in the other direction, and they're for much bolder, more transformative action, leaving aside Swiss Re and Liberty Mutual and what they're all up to today. I don't mean to digress. Say something about risk. What challenges and opportunities you see there, and then Crystal, I'll come right back to you.
Just to add to the comments about retail insurers all the way up to the reinsurers. I mean, they've been on the vanguard of pushing public sector investments in assets and infrastructure assets because, of course, they're also protecting their bottom lines. There's always been this unwritten agreement between the insurance industry and the public sector where the public sector will provide this major infrastructure to protect the community, and then insurers would protect inside. But in the kinds of insurance scenarios that you're talking about, let's not forget that insurers are leaving individual homeowners. They've done this. They did this in Florida after Hurricane Andrew. They did this in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, and they're doing it right now in California after the wildfires. So there is a big concern about risk that I'm not sure there has to be a national conversation about about property risk and property insurance, the same way we've had a conversation the last decade about health insurance. So I think it's an important conversation to have, and I think it speaks exactly to this issue of equity, because the people who can't afford the insurance, who are already existing in harm's way, have very few alternatives.
Thank you. Recently, we're talking health, economic risk, climate risk, different kinds, and how they connect. Crystal, I'm sorry. Over to you.
No, it's okay. I was struck. I find the conversation around business and government and the expectations of government from business, while business doesn't want to pay for it. They want government to pay for it, but they don't want to pay more taxes either. And so what, I'm just sort of like,
how does that add up?
I can't do the math on that. I mean, I'm not a math scholar, but I did pass addition and subtraction. And so it's just, but if you're going to run a business, right, and you envision a future, right, think about it as R&D. If you want government to be leading and that's the place you're doing R&D, then you're going to make kind of investments in that for a while before you start to see the outcomes of that. And so I don't quite understand why we're not saying to ourselves, well, I do understand why. I'm not naive, but it's like, we're going to do something different. Like, even if we do a progressive tax for 10 years, because we've got to pay to shift where we're going, like, in order to do that, right, then let's lean in and kind of like do that. And it's not forever, ever. Mm-hmm. And, but we're got to get to a different place. And this idea of scarcity is not going to get us there, right? And the corporate environment is not going to get us there, right? If you're talking about risk of the size that we're talking about, that's got to be government. Right. And so, and we've got to learn to have some greater level of confidence in government and its leadership and its ability to do that than we do today, right? Because it's government they're going to do what they can to really not leave anybody behind. But the more we get to, Carlos and I staying up all night thinking about who's in charge in elections, right? The more we get representative real government, the more that we, hopefully will have some, confidence in that. But government has got to lead on this, because all big changes that we're talking about in this country started with government, right? I mean,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go.
I was going to just ask more about that. What's the this, especially around some of the changes you are actively thinking about and experimenting with in Massachusetts? All three of us have served in government. You served as Undersecretary for Housing and Community Development for the state. I mentioned property risk a few minutes back, and that got us onto insurance, just as one more, sort of variable or lever in this. But take housing finance. We have long had a public-private hybrid system in this country. We invented the FHA, which more or less invented the 30-year amortizing mortgage, a crucial innovation. That's thanks to government, but worked with the private sector. We had a big lesson over the past year and a half about small business lending. Think Paycheck Protection Program and the inequities in the first round, and what that's all about, government guaranteeing some of the risk on lending that commercial lenders do. What would it look like? What specifics do you have in mind when it comes to having more conviction, as you said, or more confidence about government being able to play a large and crucial role? Is it a new generation of hybrid finance products or risk sharing mechanisms? Or could you say more about that?
Sure. When I think about insurance risk and appraisal, the way I've been talking about it to people is, our current appraisal system is really just the vestiges of redlining, right? And it's just like, that's where that started. And if you look at, we've been doing some looking at where communities have been redlined and where they weren't, and just comparing, like, over 50 years, what does that mean? What does that look like for, incomes in those communities and that kind of thing, right? And so what you're alluding to is the low-income housing tax credit program, right? And how that's at the heart of driving affordable rental housing in this country, right? And how you got public and private folks coming together to deal with that. We have no similar kind of thing on the homeownership side. And so you kind of like, it's a very individual kind of thought process, right? It's like, you'll build it, and then if people can afford it, they will buy it. And it's like homeownership has become this thing where it's like you have to deserve it, so to speak. And we'll like finance rental housing over here and figure out how to do that. And there are a lot of people making a lot of money in the LIHTC program. It's super complicated and all of that. But, on the homeownership side, government, they have the neighborhood homes investment tax credit program that they're pushing, and which government is creating a space, well, not creating, wanting, we're pushing to have a government create a public-private partnership to finance the appraisal gap, right? Between what you can build it for, what you can sell it for, right? And that's what I mean, right? It's like, okay, so government's going to take some of that risk and we're going to kind of lead the way. And then we're going to kind of see that, it's not that scary. And then the private market is certainly going to be all in, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, because once we can figure out that there's money to be made, the private market can help to deal with that. That's what I mean when I'm thinking about government's got to lead. Government's got to figure out how to take those first steps.
As you say that, I'm mindful that Carlos and I are here in DC, you're in Boston. Mm-hmm. For folks in these economically vibrant, though very unequal metro areas, urban economies, we can take for granted certain foundational resources, including things like property markets that are, trading properties in high, but large parts of the country have been so disinvested. Crystal is alluding to challenges where you have, let's say, city of Detroit. It was a major issue, has been for years, many others as well. Gary, Indiana, rural communities, as Carlos said earlier, where it costs more to build something than a home would be worth at the end of the day, given its location, because the bottom has dropped out of a given community. There's so little demand or what have you. We need to think more creatively about bringing back these markets in an equitable way. Carlos, your thoughts?
Wait, can I just say one more thing, please, Carlos, before you go? I just want to, we are now experiencing in the affordable LIHTC arena, huge fights with private equity firms around getting access to those properties and turning and flipping them to market. Right? Like, this is a thing that was like, no one wanted to do this 20 years ago, but government came in, they built a whole system. And now private equity is like, oh, well, you built these properties in these places nobody wanted to be in 30 years ago. And now all of a sudden, hey, like, let me step in and figure out how to like make money here. But that's what government does and is supposed to do. Sorry, right. Carlos.
No, this is a great tie-in to, I think, what I'm thinking about. And I want to tie into the Zav's question about risk earlier as well, linking housing finance with overall risk. Because I think part of the challenge is, what's happened in the last 2 years, for example, is that the overseers of the finance world, the public overseers, have started talking about climate risk, for example. Let's use this as an example, including the federal FHFA, right, have asked how much of a risk are there to the government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, with regard to climate risks. And of course, the challenge is when we start accounting for these risks, who's at the center of the risk assessment? Is it the institution or is it the people? Is it the home owner, the home buyer, or the community in which that home exists? And that's what is always forgotten. I think when it's the institution, we're going to end up getting, if we're like saying, oh, these places are climate risky for our financial institutions, so we shouldn't be investing in them, we're going to have a new red line in this country. Yeah. That's exactly what's going to happen. So poor people in disinvested communities that are now viewed as climate exposed aren't going to be invested in further. So it's the lack of thinking about who is at the core of the risk assessment that is repeated across various government agencies. And we're not just talking about housing finance policy, not even just housing policy. I mean, we've looked at places like transportation, commerce, labor, Army Corps, funding, infrastructure, and economic incubation in places that the EPA and Interior and Department of Energy have said are challenges. Right, and then HUD is left piecing together with the 2 bottles of glue that it has in its desk. So we're not thinking about who is at risk and what they need for their lives. And that's not to say that the housing finance system should be exploded. I'm a big believer in reform, not in revolution. I think what we need is a highly regulated private sector. Not a dismissal of the private sector, but to highly regulate, you have to have good government. And that's where Crystal's point is.
If we looked beyond, you guys, today's election results, and even beyond next year's midterms, we didn't worry too much about the very, very near term. What are the specific kinds of policy debates you'd love to see? This may be painful for me to ask it this way, but in the 2024 presidential and congressional elections, or put it this way, as a nation, what should we be actively debating right around the corner in order to start taking very, very seriously these trends and these futures that we confront, whether we have acknowledged them or not? Carlos, I'll start with you, given the point you just made.
Ooh, and I guess for the listeners, we should let them know that this is occurring. The conversation is actually occurring on November 3rd. You'll be hearing it later. That's why you see a lot of bags, at least under my eyes, not under my lovely colleagues' eyes. There are certain fundamental issues that have to be debated that we've avoided talking about in this country in several election cycles, right? And I think it would be good to see leaders step up to the plate to talk about racism and not pretend that racism is not still a core function of our housing markets, of our environmental injustices, et cetera, right? That these are core functions. We have to look at leaders who are, I mean, it's sad that there would have to be a debate, but that are looking at how do we prioritize historically disenfranchised communities. So it's not just by race and ethnicity, but also by income that have not had the opportunities, all of the options that we're talking about. That is the goal of our vision for shelter in this country, right? Of making sure everybody has the options that are appropriate for them and their families and their communities. We have to have that fundamental conversation about those disparities historically, and if we're going to make any change in the future. And then, so that's the big reckoning that I'd like to see. And in the future, I actually would like to start seeing leaders talk about, and we're not seeing this at the local level either, people willing to talk about what we have to do in our communities to deal with the massive exposures to climate change that we're going to be facing. That means that some communities are not going to be viable, but we shouldn't say that without immediately saying, this is what we're going to do for them. This is how we're going to give them housing and jobs and healthcare and other places as nearby to their social networks and their community networks as possible. Having that conversation about what do we value, what communities do we value culturally and historically, which spans the racial and ethnic spectrum in this country, because we have such a rich racial history in this country and wonderful cultural productions that some things we want to value. We have to have that conversation. That's going to be a debate that I would like to see. I don't know if it'll ever happen.
Carlos, thank you. Crystal, how about you? What's your list?
I don't know whether I should say I'm less optimistic or more practical. Part of the way, I think about race, listen, I'm a descendant of slaves here, right? And part of the way I think about racism is like I said, it's a fundamental part of American culture. And I don't want to play the blame game. I just want to say, like, okay, you want to have this conversation around racism, then let's have it. It's like like, don't be scared. Like, there's nothing to be afraid of. What I would like to have people talk about is not about investing in communities that have long been disinvested. I would like to have a conversation of people talking about housing and the need to actually build more. And what does that mean? And the federal government, in the same way the federal government will come down and tell you that, like, you got to do something with this bridge. I would like a conversation where the federal government goes to Cornegayville and says, you haven't built a house, in 25 years here. And so we're going to make you, whether we give you money or not. Right? We got to get people back in the production business. Mm-hmm. And if we get this country back into the production business, housing production business, then that will lead to these investments that we're talking about in certain communities. Because guess what? Those are the places that have land left. Those are the places that, have opportunity. Like those are the places in which we're going to have to talk about and think about. But if we're not doing it in a way in which we can envision a conversation in which industry benefits, then it just becomes too esoteric and people get too, kind of like polarized, well, not too more polarized than they are now. And so I want to start, I want to say to the federal government, it's great that you want to talk to the GSEs about where they should, back mortgages, but you need to be talking to localities around building housing. Everybody's got an obligation to get us back into that game.
Let me add to that, Zab, just for a second, because I think part of the issue, part of the reality is we have a housing industry in this country, from new construction builders to remodelers to the financial interveners and exchanges that are there that are incredibly nimble. I mean, this is one of the most nimble, demand-ready industries on the planet. And so maybe to your question, Zab, what the debate that I'd like to see is them fighting for what are the best new technologies, what are the best land use reforms that we could do to ensure that we're providing the right options and amount and at a price point and environmental impact of housing that we need in this country. So I would like to see debates about that, about who can out nimble each other. I'd like to see debates about how Justice 40, who can best define Justice 40 to be as inclusive as possible of as many communities and as many subgroups as possible.
Thank you both for that. Just a reference point for our viewers, knowing that the conference attracts folks from a wide array of backgrounds, not all sort of deep into housing questions, or perhaps not yet. As we begin to wrap up here, I would invite folks to take a look at last year's housing proposal. So when we were at an early stage in the presidential election cycle, Data for Progress, for example, it's really a polling group, but sort of provides scorecards, rated all of the Democrats on their housing proposals. So it's an interesting little time capsule to sort of go back and look at how they reviewed Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, go on down the list. And one of the proposals at the time related to this question, how could the federal government challenge, but Crystal, to your point, also insist that communities of all types share, the old concept in housing is fair share in the work of providing housing opportunities, decent, safe, affordable. So it's interesting given where we are now. We'll see where we are in 6 months or 24 months, but to think about what the debate was early, right. So 2019 into 2020, some of the COVID, these big proposals look like. As we wrap up here, I want to ask you both to offer us any thoughts you have on regions that are lagging. They may be still depopulating, losing talent, losing their young people to other parts of the country, simply because we don't often center them, and we have a tendency to think of them monolithically too as being white, working class, and then commentators sort of off to the races on the politics of all this. And in fact, they are racially diverse, culturally diverse. Tend to be poorer because one reason they're lagging is they don't have the most competitive industries. Crystal, in your state, they include some of the earliest industrial towns in this country: Lawrence, Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Springfield, et cetera, et cetera. They're not beacons of high tech these days, not for now. But one begins to think about this future, the medium and longer run that we've been talking about, and both the challenges they face, but also opportunities they may offer as places that tend to have more abundant land, certain natural resources, and a hunger to be vibrant again, even if it's in a completely different way. So I would just invite you to share any thoughts you have. Crystal, I'm going to start with you, and I'll give you a time signal. We've got about 4 minutes left, so maybe a couple minutes from each of you, and then we'll wrap. Does that sound okay?
Sure. Like this pandemic, right, is like, has taught us to think differently about work. And so, because you brought up these communities, Springfield is, I want to say, it's a community. It's kind of in Western Mass, kind of, and it's been struggling for a while, right? In terms of different things. But what if, right? And so there's all this conversation around, let's get a transportation system that connects Springfield to Greater Boston, which is really the economic engine of Massachusetts, and some would argue of New England, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's get a transportation system to do that. I say, no, let's build 1,500 homes, high tech in Springfield. And let's connect those folks with the technology, the fintech, whatever industries there are in Boston. And let's do that. And let's think differently about where people have to work and live and how people do that, because we just turned the whole idea about work from home and what that means up on its head, like that, right? Like that. Like all the ideas about what it means to work from home and what that means, like all of that went out the window, just like that. And so there was a whole disruption about that. And so that's why I want to have these conversations around, what do we do around what's everybody's fair share in terms of housing production? Because Springfield is also a city in which it's largely diverse, Latin American descendants. And so we start to get at the things that Carlos and I care about, but in a different way, right? And investing in that in a different way.
Chris, I want to make sure I follow you before we give Carlos the final thought here, final comment. It's a home and talent-centered regenerative strategy. And then folks need connections. So the digital connections, the transport connections as well, but start by attracting people in to take advantage of the special opportunities these places represent. Carlos, your thoughts?
That is actually going to be very related to my point. So there's an interesting climate angle to your question, Zav. There are a lot of these former Rust Belt and Midwestern cities that are proposing to be climate receiving communities in the future. And there's an actual active public marketing, public relations campaign by these city governments.
Carlos, would you define that? I don't want to assume that phrase is familiar to everybody.
Certainly. So climate receiving community is people who are displaced by either an acute climate disaster like a hurricane or by slow onset chronic climate effects like sea level rise. So in those places that I'm saying may not be viable physically anymore, that some places like Duluth, Minnesota, Buffalo, New York are presenting themselves as options for people to move to supplement their populations. The reality is, in the studies at least that I have done, usually in these receiving communities, after about a year and a half, the welcome mat gets worn very thin once communities realize the demography of the people who are moving in, that because the people who need to move are going to be the low income, the communities of color that live in historically disadvantaged, highly exposed places, right? So I would say what I would like to see in the long term, and what I would hope would be the debate, is which of these communities have figured out how to support their existing populations and integrate newcomers in the best possible way so that you're forming entirely new cohesive communities. That's really going to be the challenge for equity in housing, about how do we get, again, people to realize that they're part of a bigger whole than their own house.
Carlos, Crystal, thank you so much. I'd love to keep this conversation going. There's so much to talk about. We are at time. Huge thanks to both of you for making time today, and also for the incredible and important work you do. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. Thank you, everybody. Take good care.